Yeah, again, as you mentioned, I'm a fourth year PhD student at Georgetown University working with Dr. Adam Green. Today, I'm going to be talking about understanding and enhancing creative analogical reasoning. And so just as a bit of an overview, our lab is broadly interested in creativity, but also reasoning. And for a long time, those abilities are thought to have been separate. But one way that we found to sort of bridge the connection between these two abilities is through the lens of analogical reasoning. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. So I'm going to take you guys on a bit of a journey. So we're going to start out in 2006 with some basic analogy word pair findings and look at the several neuroimaging studies that revealed the brain basis for analogical reasoning and talk about different results that we have from those studies. Then I'll talk about another analogy task that we developed called the analogy matrix, which moves multiple word pairs together and in a different way of solving those problems, and talk about explicitly augmenting one's creative state in the context of this task. And then I'll talk about the relevance of creative analogical reasoning for computer science courses in college STEM classrooms. And then lastly, I'll talk about some brain stimulation studies that sort of capitalize on those earlier neuroimaging studies to try to enhance analogical reasoning by targeting different brain regions and networks. So we're covering a lot of ground today. All right, so first, before we get too deep into it, I want to talk about this concept of semantic distance, because this is something that will come up a lot. And some of you may or may not be familiar with it, but either way, I just wanted to sort of set some ground rules, essentially. So our lab is largely interested in distant analogical reasoning. So by distant, I mean reasoning that involves abstract similarities between concepts that are different on the surface level, but share the same analogical mapping. And so we consider this sort of semantically distant analogy solving to be a form of creativity where more distant connections require more creativity to solve. So today, I'm primarily going to be focusing on verbal analogies that are sort of proportional. So, for example, ones that use word pairs. So, kitten is to cat. There's other sort of word pairs that you could generate to form an analogy pair with that. One example would be puppy is to dog. So, one thing starts small, turns into something larger. And this is a very sort of closely semantically related analogy, in that kitten and cat and puppy and dog are both very close in semantic relation. They're both types of animals. Another example of an analogous word pair would be dollar is to fortune. So this is again something small that turns into something bigger, and an even more distant would be spark is to fire. So again, they share the same analogical mapping, something small that turns into something larger. But they're in very different categories entirely, and bridge lots of semantic distance. So spark and fire is in a totally different domain of semantic knowledge than kitten is to cat. And so one way that we've sort of quantitatively analyzed this, the semantic distance is through this technique called semantic analysis. There's several different kinds of it. A lot of our earlier work used latent semantic analysis. And more recently, we've been using tools like SemDis, which I'll talk about in a second. But essentially, it's a quantitative way of looking at the co-occurrence of these words in a very large semantic space. So, for example, you could look at like all of the text on Wikipedia and see how often do puppy and dog come near the words kitten and cat, and those would be a lot more sort of frequently co-occurring. And it's a complicated mathematical equation involving cosine waves. We're not going to get too into the weeds on this one because we didn't develop the technique. We just used it sort of approximate the semantic distance, which we've also found to be related to, more semantic distance requires more creativity to solve. So for example, you can see that if you calculate the semantic distance, starting with kitten to cat, puppy and dog are, closer, and then dollar and fortune are further in semantic distance, and then spark and fire being the furthest distance. And again, so this concept of semantic distance will be used heavily throughout this work, as that's one of the main ways that we measure performance in creative analogical problem-solving tasks. And I'll talk about it a little bit later, but it's different than a lot of ways of scoring creativity, and maybe also different than a lot of ways of measuring analogical reasoning, which may be just sticking to accuracy or response time. Here we're looking at something in between. Okay. All right, so as I said, it begins in 2006. There's a paper by my advisor, Dr. Adam Green, titled Frontopolar Cortex Mediates Abstract Integration in Analogy. And so for this study, we used a basic sort of analogy word pair task, as we've talked about before, where you have, planet is the sun as electron is a nucleus. We also had a control task that matched for semantic relations and categorical relations, but did not actually have analogies. So for example, cow is to milk and duck is to water. So cow and milk are in the same sort of, they're semantically related, and cow and duck are in the same sort of category. So we're controlling for the categorical and semantic processing, but not the ability to create these analogical mappings and solve the problems. So our goal with this study was to look at what brain regions are activated during analogical reasoning that are not activated during our control task. So this was in 2006. So there was a sample of 14. This is the earlier stage of neuroimaging. And with that simple contrast of what brain regions are activated during analogy problems, but not during the control task, we found first evidence of this frontopolar cortex. As you can see, the little yellow cluster. It's a part of the prefrontal cortex, and here's another image showing that as well. So we see increased activation in frontopolar cortex, and on the image on the right shows activation that is combined with both the control task and the analogy task. And here we see lots of activation, in many other brain regions, including this broader frontoparietal network. So we see that the frontoparietal network is important for processing and answering questions about semantic and categorical relations, but the only cluster that's unique to analogical problem solving is this frontopolar cortex. But those regions are also activated during the control task. So this was our sort of first evidence of this frontopolar cortex, and we quickly sort of followed up on it to further investigate its role in analogical reasoning. So the next study is bringing in this concept of semantic distance. So this is entitled Connecting Long Distance Semantic Distance in Analogical Reasoning Modulates Frontopolar Cortex Activity. So here we're using the same word pairs that I've talked about before. We also have this distinction of a within domain analogy. Again, nose is to scent as tongue is to taste. Those are the same mappings, and they're both within this domain of sensory experience, whereas antenna to signal is in a different domain than nose to scent, but shares the same analogy. And so these cross-domain analogies bridge more semantic distance, and the within domain bridge less. This is sort of a categorical way of distinguishing them, but we also looked at it with semantic distance between the word pairs as a continuous measure. So for this study, we look to see, now we have 23 people. We look to see, what regions were activated, but beyond that, we look to see in sort of a parametric analysis where we entered in the semantic distance values of the problems, and we look to see what regions of the brain correlate with increased semantic distance. So when you do trials that have higher semantic distance versus lower, where do we see more activation? And what we found here is, again, this frontopolar cluster emerged. So basically, again, we parametrically varied semantic distance values, and then this analysis revealed that semantic distance predicted activity in the frontopolar cortex during analogical reasoning. And this is even after we controlled for the effects of task difficulty. And so this is one of the first brain-based characterizations of semantic distance in analogical reasoning, and identifying frontopolar cortex as a key mechanism. So really looking at the way that activity in this region, not just that there is activity, but the increase in activity mediates this semantic distance. So we propose that this region is really important for bridging these abstract connections between semantically distant responses. And if you notice in the title of this paper that there's no mention of creativity yet. We were thinking of them as creativity with semantic distance, but one comment we actually got from reviewers is that this doesn't actually measure creativity because you're not having to generate anything or any ideas, you're simply solving an analogy problem. And while we did push back on that, because even within the context of deciding if there's an analogy or not in these word pair problems, you still have to generate an analogical mapping between each word pair and then comparing them together. That's not something that this automatically is present without you having to generate and process that. However, this was sort of earlier in this research before we're more established with this. So we did do a follow-up study to kind of further investigate creativity explicitly in the context of analogical reasoning. So there was another paper we did called The Neurocorrelates of Creativity in Analogical Reasoning. And here we had a similar task, except it required the generation of the fourth term. So you have blindness as the sight, and then poverty, and the participant's task was to generate another word that would fulfill that analogy. And so the idea here is that this involves, idea generation, which is an important part of creativity, and not just solving the problem, but coming up with a way to bridge that connection. But we had a very similar data set and a very similar design, and we basically found very similar results that, other parametric analysis revealed that the brain activity that was correlated to increase in semantic distance between these word pairs was also, again, in frontopolar cortex. So stronger frontopolar cortex activation for more semantically distant analogies that were generated. So really cool to sort of replicate the previous study, and also in the context of generation. It doesn't necessarily matter if you're solving the problem or if you're generating it. We still find that this semantic distance is mediated or bridged through this frontopolar cortex region. So at this point, we have 3 fMRI studies showing consistent region that supports analogical reasoning and is activated during this task, but also supports more semantically distant analogical reasoning, which is, again, a proxy for more creative reasoning. So I don't know if any of you have done fMRI imaging. It's very rare to find such a sort of convergent finding over multiple different studies. And so we're really encouraged by this and sort of wanted to investigate it further. But that's something that I'll come back to when we talk about the brain stimulation. All right, so another variation of this task that we developed was this analogy matrix task. And so here we looked at also another way to sort of involve creativity within the context of this task. So there's a paper by Adam Weinberg and Adam Green called Conscious Augmentation of Creative State Enhances Real Creativity in Open-Ended Analogical Reasoning. So here we developed, instead of just having 2 word pairs, we created an analogy task where, analogy matrix, wherein participants could go row by row and cell by cell and compare whether or not these word pairs formed an analogy. So you could look with, watermelon is to rind, as to sweeper is to street, and decide that's not an analogy, but then see planet and soil and decide that is an analogy. So this is just a small portion of the matrix. We actually had many more rows. You can't really see it, but I just wanted to show you that we developed basically 2 separate matrices and did all this sort of normative data collection and validated that they were valid analogies. But there's many, there's far more incorrect analogies than there are correct. So it does take some searching to find the ones that are actually valid. And so just a little bit more on this work. So another thing that our lab has studied is this idea of conscious augmentation of creative state. And so what we found there, and in other contexts, there's a task called the verb generation task. We present participants with a noun, for example, fork, and they have to generate a verb that's related in any way. One example would be eat, which is a pretty common response. But if you were to say, instead of saying eat, you would say decide, that would be a more semantically distant response in relation to fork, and also a more creative response. And so we found this effect, basically, this cueing effect, that if we simply just instruct participants to think creatively when they're solving those problems, they actually generate responses that are more semantically distant. And the extent to which they're able to do this is correlated with other measures of creativity. But one interesting thing about this is that we're studying creativity as a state. So creativity is predominantly studied as a trait level phenomenon where some people are more or less creative than other people. And people will measure creativity with a task and then relate it to something and say that they found individual differences in creativity as a trait. But we were interested in the state. So people of all levels of creativity, if you cue them to think creatively, they're able to enhance their creativity in the moment. So that's like sort of prior work that leads up to this work. Now, with this study, we wanted to look at this in the context of analogical reasoning. So can we cue people to think creatively, and then will they generate or solve more and more semantically distant problems? So one of the ways we did this is we basically presented them with two of these matrices. So we counterbalanced the order, but we started with one, and they had, I think, 3 minutes to answer as many analogies as they wanted to, or as they could. And our instructions were, try to make as many analogies as you can. However, only valid analogies should be listed. So don't list analogies unless you can describe how the word pairs are analogous. And they'd solve that matrix. And then we'd have them do the second matrix, but this time we would give them that creativity cue. So we'd say, this time the task is the same, but this time please think creatively as you search for valid analogies. And so just this simple cue to think creatively, we found in a sample, an online sample on mTurk, that it did lead to increased semantic distance overall in the second matrix compared to the first matrix. And it was a pretty robust effect. And so again, this demonstrates that previously when we're studying analogical reasoning, we weren't cueing people to think creatively. We were just looking at semantic distance as a proxy for the amount of creativity involved. But now we're explicitly cueing creativity, and we find that it does also increase the semantic distance of responses. So this was a really cool effect that not only validated this matrix task, which we've used a lot since then, but demonstrated that you can consciously augment your creative state in the context of analogical reasoning. And so kind of building on all this work, we put out a review paper called Creativity Within Reason. And so this was looking at semantic distance and dynamic state creativity in relational thinking and reasoning. So this included work, basically summarizing what I've just told you about, all of the neuroimaging evidence indicating this frontal polar cortex region as a mediating brain mechanism for bridging these semantically distant connections. And also looking at another study, which I haven't mentioned, that looked at verb generation. And we also find the same results, that when you generate more semantically distant verbs, participants also showed increased frontal polar activity with the same sort of parametric correlation. And so part of the purpose of this was to sort of summarize all this work and what we know so far, and then what we want to do going forward. But another purpose was sort of, again, a lot of this research started in analogy and then slowly bridged its way to creativity. So this paper was, one of the impacts it had basically was raising awareness in the field of creativity, that you can study it within the context of reasoning, because a lot of creativity research in the past is focused on more what's called divergent thinking tasks, where the task is to sort of think of something totally new and different that's unrelated. And there's another concept of convergent creativity or convergent thinking, which is coming and selecting the correct response. And one reason that we like this task is that it kind of requires both of those abilities. So you have to generate this analogical mapping, but you also have to, you're limited by the constraints of the task and have to there is a correct answer. And we can sort of analyze it with quantitative data. Whereas again, most creativity tasks require like human ratings of originality. And every rating system has its own pros and cons, including semantic distance. It's not a perfect measure, but this sort of put this task and this way of scoring creativity onto the map within that field. And since then has grown and grown in popularity. Okay, so now deviating a little bit to a little bit more recent work. We have a study that's currently in press called Predictive Effects of Creative Abilities and Attitudes on Performance in University Level Computer Science Classes. So here we're looking at the real world relevance of this creative analogical ability. So what we did actually is, hold on, let me get my notes for this slide. So we had a sample of, again, we're looking at computer science courses at Georgetown, and we had a sample of 132 students in these classes. And the goal was kind of an exploratory study to see what measures of creativity, if any, predicted grades in these computer science classes. So we collected many different measures of creativity at the beginning of the semester, and then at the end of the semester, we collected grades. And so we had a lot of different measures. We had, alternative uses task. Again, I haven't really, it's not really the focus of this talk, but we had other main measures of creativity, such as alternative uses, where you're presented with an object and you have to come up with an unusual use. So if you're given brick and you have to think of an unusual way to use it, that's more of a divergent thinking task. And then we have this remote associates task, or the RAT, where you're shown 3 words and you have to come up with a missing word that they may be related semantically or not. Again, that's not really the focus of this task. We also included this analogy matrix task, and we had a condition where they were not cued to think creatively and a condition where they were cued. We also had Raven's progressive matrices. We had syllogistic reasoning. And we also looked at their course level, whether it was introductory or upper level. And out of all of these variables, the only one that predicted grades was performance on the analogy finding task when participants were cued to think creatively. We also looked at other measures of not necessarily cognitive ability, but more sort of beliefs or affective variables, such as your creativity anxiety, your general anxiety, your anxiety about computer science, as well as the sort of overlap measure of the extent to which you identify with computer science, the extent to which you view computer science as something creative. Anyway, just the point of this is that we had a lot of different measures, and it was very exploratory, and yet the only result that significantly predicted grades was on this analogy finding task. And so here's like a figure sort of showing that the cued analogy matrix performance significantly predicted computer science grades. And this is even when we control for some of those other measures, such as performance on the Raven's progressive matrices, which is a proxy for fluid intelligence. And this is also when we control for sort of false alarms. Yeah, one thing I forgot to mention about the analogy matrix is that even when participants are cued to think creatively and they generate more semantically distant responses, that doesn't, our data did not indicate that they generated more false alarms, that they identified more problems that weren't analogous. So it's not as though they're becoming, they're not becoming more generous with their problem solving and saying that everything's an analogy, but they're actually finding the correct responses, even if they bridge more semantic distance. So this was a really cool result that just kind of showed the real world relevance of this ability. So we've studied it up to this point, looking at sort of the cognitive ability to augment your creative state. We looked at the brain regions that support it. And here's evidence that this ability is not only is it interesting, but it's also important for performance in real world college STEM courses. And so part of our interpretation here is that the students who are better at making connections, creative connections, may do better on computer science exams, because those exams involve lots of questions that require you to take information you've learned in one context and apply it to new contexts. And obviously there's a lot of literature on the importance of analogy in learning. And yeah, it's a sort of a very intuitive thing that being able to bridge these connections, but also very interesting that, this task is again in the verbal domain, and the ability to bridge those connections there predicts the ability to bridge those connections with computer science code, which I guess is verbal, but also very very different. So really excited about this one, and again, it should be published soon. It's accepted, just sort of waiting for that to be finalized in this new translational special issue. Okay, all right, now shifting gears a little bit more, kind of following up on that earlier neuroscience work. Now looking at using brain stimulation to enhance creative analogical reasoning. So now that we have identified this frontal polar cortex, as a neuroscientist, you kind of, one of the starting points, if you're interested in a cognitive ability, is, okay, what brain regions are activated when you're doing this thing? So we found that 3 times in a row. We replicated that result and found the sort of mediation with semantic distance. So we're really encouraged. And the next step to that, up to that point, you're just really showing a correlation, which is very interesting. You're showing that frontal polar cortex is activated when you're having to solve these tasks, but we don't have a causal connection yet. We don't know that the increase in activation causes you to solve these problems. So one way to capitalize on that is to use brain stimulation, where you selectively modulate those targeted brain regions based on your fMRI results. And essentially, here we're using tDCS, or transcranial direct current stimulation, which essentially modulates the cortical excitability of a brain region and makes those neurons more likely to fire. So it's not necessarily making them activate, but if you're going to use that brain region, it'll be easier to activate more neurons because of the stimulation. So again, we're searching for this causal connection between this brain region and this ability that we previously did not have just from correlational fMRI evidence. So again, we have, for this study, 31 participants. It was a between subject design. And here we're using this high definition tDCS, where we, prior to doing the study, modeled the electrical field that we would target to hit this frontopolar cortex. And again, feeding in all that fMRI data we had before, trying to target this region and look at how it impacts performance on the creative analogical reasoning task. And again, the control condition is a sham condition where we set up the stimulation, but we don't actually deliver the stimulation. So participants think they're getting brain stimulation, but they're not actually. So this is to control for placebo effects. And another reason we did it between subjects is because if you've actually had brain stimulation, you can kind of tell whether or not you're getting it. So between subjects, one group doesn't have a prior experience with brain stimulation, and so they really could think that it's real. All right. So just jumping right into the results, we basically found that when participants received tDCS to the frontopolar cortex, they again improved or basically bridged more semantic distance, and this was using the matrix task that I talked to you about earlier. So again, similar to that queuing effect that we saw, in this case, both of the matrices that they solved were queued, and again, with simulation, they solved more semantically distant responses. Another effect that we found within this study, which again is goes back to that verb generation task that I was mentioning before, is we looked at the interaction of this creativity cue and brain stimulation. And what we found there, and again, this is with the verb generation task, not the analogy matrix task, but I thought it was important to share, is that we find a really cool interaction effect between tDCS and this creativity cue. So just when receiving tDCS, but when you're uncued, receiving tDCS to this frontopolar cortex region doesn't necessarily make your responses more creative. But when you're cued to think creatively and you're trying to use this part of your brain region, or you're trying to think more creatively, then the stimulation shows this more pronounced effect with this interaction. So this is really interesting, again, showing that the brain stimulation isn't making you use this brain region or making you creative, but it sort of interacts with your active conscious effort to be creative. So this is a result that has been found across a number of other brain stimulation studies, that the most effective forms of brain stimulation are usually paired with some sort of explicit instruction or cognitive training where you're trying to use this brain region. So again, just with brain stimulation in general, it's not the case that it's going to magically make you a genius. It's only going to sort of extend your own abilities when you're trying to do that thing with 10 to 15% range of variance. And so again, showing that this sort of interaction effect. So that was a study we did 2016. We did another brain stimulation study, and again, looking at this connection between creativity and reasoning. So here we were going back to using the analogy word pairs, not the matrix, just because we wanted to look at reaction time as well. In a shorter duration. And so one thing we know about, again, as I've talked about, we know that this analogical reasoning is supported by this frontoparietal network. So that's something I talked about in the very first study. We saw frontopolar cortex was just an analogy, but also this frontoparietal network was activated during an analogy. And that's something we hadn't yet tested. The first brain stimulation study was following up on the frontopolar cortex, and this study was meant to test what if we stimulate this larger brain network? So not just one region, but an entire brain network. And so previous studies have shown that if you, that this frontoparietal network also supports working memory ability. So this is a digit span task where you're shown a collection of numbers and you have to hold more and more numbers in mind. And when participants are solving this task, we see activation in this frontoparietal network. Additional research has shown that when you stimulate this brain network, using another technique, which is called transcranial alternating current stimulation. So this is different than tDCS in that now you're applying stimulation to multiple regions at once. So, maybe DLPFC and posterior parietal cortex, and you're specifying a particular frequency at which to stimulate. So this builds on a lot of EEG-based literature, looking at the sort of cortical oscillations that we see within different brain regions within a network during a different task. So we also know that there's this sort of frontoparietal synchrony in the in this network when people are solving working memory tasks. So using fMRI evidence shows that this network is activated. EEG evidence shows that when it's activated, it's oscillating at this theta frequency, which is a particular, there's all these different frequency bands. And so additional research has showed that when you stimulate this network at theta frequency, it can improve working memory ability, again, demonstrating a causal connection between this brain network and the theta oscillations to working memory. And so that's one thing that, another reason why we're interested in stimulating this network is because within these analogy tasks, you have to hold different items within working memory. So if I'm comparing nose and scent to antenna and signal, I have to sort of hold nose and scent in my working memory and process that in analogical mapping, and then compare it to antenna and signal. And so given that the same brain resources are activated during working memory and that stimulating them can improve working memory, we had reason to suspect that stimulating this brain network could also improve analogical reasoning. Someone's raised their hand. Do I?
Yeah, Alex, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, I'm sorry to interrupt. Have you tried other frequencies? Stimulating on some other frequency band?
Yeah, so far this study, which I'll go into more detail, is focused on theta frequency. But we've done other studies looking at different tasks besides an analogy task, where we looked at alpha frequency as well, and found kind of mixed results. That's one thing that is a bit is a pro and con of tACS, is that you're able to specify the frequency, but that also kind of multiplies the possible study designs that you could do, because you have alpha, beta, theta, gamma, all these different frequency bands. So typically, the best case scenario is that you have prior evidence of a certain frequency band that's associated with that ability, that you can then build as a hypothesis for why you're using that brain that frequency when you're applying stimulation. But some studies have shown they'll do a stimulation and then sort of an active stimulation at a different frequency band. So actually, not shown here, but another study showed that if you stimulate this network at gamma, it doesn't improve working memory, but theta specifically does. So you can show specificity to a certain frequency band. For our study, we just used theta because of the constraints of running participants, and you can quickly multiply this to many different cells, and the amount of participants you need to get to test for a statistical effect. But the answer to your question is no, we haven't tried something beside theta yet, but that's something we're interested in the future.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. So again, this is all sort of the empirical justification and why we were interested in this, combined with that prior neuroimaging evidence. And there's other papers that have found this frontoparietal network supports analogical reasoning, not just our research. It's sort of a very consistent finding from many different labs. Okay, so based on all that evidence, we conducted another brain stimulation study. And here we delivered tACS at theta to left DLPFC and left posterior parietal cortex to target this frontoparietal network. So we had a very sizable sample here, 118 participants. And so we had 3 different conditions. So the first, here you can see the sites of our stimulation, and you can see the electrical field that's produced. So we had 3 different conditions. The first condition is the sham, where we set up the stimulation, but we don't actually deliver it. We had 40 participants there. Then there's the 0-degree phase difference condition, which is theorized to synchronize the cortical oscillations between the 2 regions. So the current is traveling between these nodal electrodes and the cathodal back and forth, and they're started at the exact same time, and they're in phase with one another. And so the sort of prior theory and evidence suggests that synchronizing these cortical oscillations within the frontoparietal network at this theta frequency can enhance working memory performance, but also the idea is to sort of increase connectivity and synchronization within this network to get these brain regions talking to each other and synchronize their oscillations. So there's also another condition, which is the 180-degree phase difference. So now there's actually a phase offset. So they're sort of flipped with one another, And the purpose of this stimulation is to desynchronize cortical oscillations between these different brain regions, which should, in theory, disrupt communication and disrupt function. And that's what prior evidence has shown. Again, that earlier study I mentioned showed that the synchronized condition improved working memory, the desynchronized impaired working memory. So the reason we had both conditions was to show a causal connection in both the positive and the negative directions, that we can enhance this ability and we can also knock it out, which would provide sort of the strongest possible causal evidence of the importance of the frontal parietal network for analogical, verbal analogical reasoning. All right, so just to cover the tasks, again, I'm going to talk about a little bit more tasks than just the verbal analogy task because we did more in the study and I think it's relevant. So we looked at visual analogy, verbal analogy, and the digit span. So for the visual analogy task, this is a task developed by Swice and Morrison. It's kind of similar to a Raven's task, but sort of built down into a stimuli by stimuli level. It's a test that they generated, and you have visual object pairs, and they vary along many different dimensions. So they can vary in terms of their luminance, like the color, as well as the orientation of the arrows. And another condition is the number, which is the number of dots. So in this case, you're comparing the top and the bottom. So before each trial, participants were cued to focus on different aspects of the stimuli to decide if they were analogous in terms of those aspects. So if you're cued to think of luminance, you can see that this, from this shape, it gets darker to lighter, and this one also gets darker to lighter, so they would be analogous in that form. And then in orientation, this one rotates towards the left over here, and that one also goes up towards the left. So in this case, this would be a valid analogy. And again, there are many different conditions in which you're only cued. There are some conditions where you're only cued to focus on one aspect of the stimuli. So it would just be luminance and no orientation. Some where you can cue to think of both. And then there's also some cases where, it's analogous in all of these terms, but not in another aspect of the visual stimuli. So for example, with number, it increases from 3 to 4, and this one actually decreases from 2 to 1. So there's sort of a conflicting aspect of the stimuli that's not analogous, but you're not cued to it. We varied it along all these different dimensions, but for the purpose of this study, we mostly just looked at overall, accuracy and performance. So the verbal analogy task is similar to what I've described before, where we have, flowers to bouquet, link is to chain, puppy, dog, kitten, cat, same sort of thing. And these were also varied in terms of their semantic distance. There were different kinds of relations. And then we also looked at this digit span task. So again, the ability to hold more objects in mind. You're shown a set of numbers, and then you have to recall them, and it advances based on your performance. So if you continue to get more and more right, you could get up to 8 different numbers at once, versus if you get it wrong, you'll be stuck at the same level. And so again, the purpose here was to sort of replicate prior research that I mentioned, that tACS to this frontal parietal network at theta improved working memory. So in one of our ideal hypotheses would be that we would find improvements in both analogy tasks as well as the digit span task, and that the extent of improvement in the working memories task and the digit span task would predict or statistically mediate the effect that we saw in the analogy task. Because again, our hypothesized mechanism is working memory. This improves working memory, so it should improve analogy ability, and we could sort of establish this direct causal link. However, the results did not necessarily pan out that way, but that's sort of very common with a lot of brain stimulation studies. So with the working memory results, we actually didn't see a significant effect across the different conditions in terms of the digit span. So we did not replicate prior findings that stimulating this network at theta improves working memory. And so this is actually very common within the field of brain stimulation. A lot of these effects don't replicate. Many are small samples, and there's also just a lot of variability with brain stimulation. There's many different stimulation parameters, protocols, and even the way that you set up the montage, you may actually be targeting different brain regions. So there's many reasons why we may not have found this effect. And especially with tACS, it's a bit of a newer technique. And so we sort of know less about its exact mechanisms and how it works. But anyway, so we didn't replicate the effect in working memory. With verbal analogy, we also did not find a statistically significant effect. It's kind of nearing significance, actually, where the desynchronized condition actually showed the highest performance in terms of accuracy, which was, pretty much opposite to our prediction. We would predict that the desynchronized condition would impair performance, but it actually improved it. And again, not significantly in the case of this task. So again, that kind of raises questions about whether or not this 180-degree out of phase is actually desynchronizing, or is it just stimulating a different part of the cortex? And I'll get a little bit more of that later. We did find effects with this visual analogy task. So we found a significant improvement with the desynchronized condition, again, above and beyond the synchronized and the sham condition. So again, pretty much opposite to what we expected. And, this is not the condition we thought we'd expect it. But again, one thing about neuroscience and brain stimulation, I think it's very humbling. It shows sort of how little you actually, we have all these reasons to hypothesize certain directions of effects, but the brain is very, very complicated. And the effects of the stimulation are also complicated. There's a lot of debate with tACS about its exact mechanism. Is it synchronizing cortical oscillations, or is it changing spike time plasticity? And also with this synchronized versus desynchronized, since that earlier work with working memory showing that improvement and impairment, there's been other papers not replicating those effects and sort of questioning theoretically what the effects are having, the effects of the stimulation on this brain regions. And that actually, it could just be, sorry to scroll back, it could just be that you're stimulating a different part of the cortex. So I don't know if you can see my mouse or not. Here we're stimulating in the 0-degree phase difference. The current is starting here and then going to the central anode and back and forth. And same with here. So they're starting at the same time to synchronize this DLPFC and this posterior parietal. In the 180-degree phase difference, we basically just flip one of these electrodes. So now the current from this one starts up here at the control electrode and goes back and forth. So it could be the case that it's not necessarily desynchronizing these regions, it's just synchronizing DLPFC with a bit more medial posterior parietal cortex instead of more lateral. So it could just be that brain region is more important. We really sort of need to do more evidence in order to suss that out. And in general with tACS, there's not been a ton of research. There's far less than tDCS or other forms of brain stimulation. So some conclusions for that particular study is that they do support the causal role of the frontoparietal network in visual analogical reasoning, but not verbal analogical reasoning, but again, not in the expected direction. They also look the same if we control for fluid intelligence and crystallized intelligence. And it raises the question of whether or not this 180-degree phase stimulation truly desynchronizes cortical oscillations between brain regions for those reasons I just discussed. So some next steps to that is that we also do have EEG imaging data for this study, and that's something that we're currently analyzing now. So that's really helpful to have because we can actually look at the effects of the brain stimulation and see, what happened in this 0-degree versus 180-degree stimulation condition. Did it actually synchronize or desynchronize? So we have all that data and are able to see the actual effects on the brain, and hopefully that will reveal more what's going on here. But again, we're early in the stage of research with tACS, and this study is actually, methodologically moving the field forward. And hopefully what we find here can not just reveal, the neural correlates or the causal neural networks that are related to analogical reasoning, but also, aspects of how this network works in a domain general way and how brain stimulation impacts that network. Okay, so I want to just look at some overall conclusions based on everything that I've talked about today. So first, creative analogical reasoning requires bridging connections across semantic distance. And we also know from FRI evidence that this frontopolar cortex and the frontoparietal network are sort of correlated with this ability. And in particular, the frontopolar cortex mediates the abstraction of semantic distance within the context of this task. We also know that this creative analogical reasoning ability predicts success in college STEM education, basically through computer science grades. So it has very much real world relevance. And then lastly, We have tDCS-based evidence that demonstrates the frontal polar cortex causally supports creative analogical reasoning, but so far we don't have the same evidence for the frontal parietal network, but we're sort of still continuing investigations. Yeah, and so some future directions would be to apply other kinds of brain stimulation in terms of enhancing analogical reasoning. So we could look to enhance, but also disrupt function. So another form of stimulation is random noise stimulation, which randomly stimulates a certain brain region. There's also transcranial magnetic stimulation, which there's many different kinds of that, and it can inhibit or excite parts of the brain region. There's also focused ultrasound stimulation, which can reach deeper parts of the cortex. All of these have different mechanisms and different effects. And then also neurofeedback training. So we could do a sort of neurofeedback training that tries to get participants to increase activity in frontal polar cortex and then have them do a creative analogical reasoning task afterwards to see if putting them in this sort of brain state of bridging semantic distance also leads to improvements on that task. We've also been doing some work looking at creative analogy across modality that Adam Weinberger has been doing and is currently has a paper in publication. Okay, so that's basically all that I want to talk about today. So thanks to my collaborators, Adam Green, Bob Morrison at Loyola, Adam Weinberger, and Rich Jaker, both at Georgetown. And then also thank you to funding resources, the Patrick Healy Graduate Fellowship, the Templeton Foundation, and the National Science Foundation, which has helped fund all of this work. And yeah, thanks so much. Let me know if you have any questions.